Okay, hello folks. So in this lecture video, we'll be going over the actual theory of natural selection as proposed by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was the first individual to propose a feasible mechanism for evolution, and that mechanism is called natural selection. Natural selection is a process by which the characteristics of a population, not those of an individual, change over time. And conceptually, it's actually very simple. We say that natural selection is consequent of three conditions, meaning it arises from kind of three building blocks that serve as a foundation for it. And those three conditions are 1, variation, 2, inheritance, and 3, differential reproductive success. So this concept of variation, this is something that is continuously reiterated when speaking about evolution and evolutionary topics. Natural selection and evolution act on variation within a population. It's because there's variation that you can actually have natural selection occurring. And when you look at a population, no individuals are exactly the same, right? They vary slightly in different traits. That's variation. Individuals of a population differ from one another. So, for example, looking at this population of beetles here, there's some individuals that vary in size, right? There's some larger beetles, some that are kind of medium size, and then some very small. And they also vary in color. You have these bright red beetles and some very dull yellow colored. Those are all variations. These variations in phenotypes have a genetic component. So it's because of allelic combinations that you get these different phenotypes. So because of that genetic component, many of these differences can be passed on from generation to generation. And that's where you get the second condition, which is inheritance. So again, the passage of these traits from parent to offspring. So you have the continuance of certain traits, and that's often why offspring tend to resemble their parents. So with the third condition, differential reproductive success, this is pertaining to how individuals with certain traits are more successful than others at surviving or reproducing in their environment. And that's because of certain selective pressures. One of those variants may be better suited for the environment. So with our little beetles here, it turns out that these red beetles are actually very bitter in taste, and therefore they're avoided by predators. So instead, the predators will select for these dull yellow ones. So these dull yellow ones are highly predated, whereas the bitter reds are not. And that means because of that selective predation, that these red beetles are more likely to survive. Because they're more likely to survive, they have a higher probability of reproduction in comparison to these dull beetles. So kind of the cumulative product of these three conditions in reference to natural selection is that you get kind of changes in the proportions of different variations or different variants within a population over time, and they're going to change based on selective pressures. So because of the selective pressures existing in this moment in time, in this situation, which was the selective predation by your birds, you have a shift in the proportion of red variants versus yellow variants, where you actually are selecting for the success of the red beetles because they're bitter in taste. So over time, you have a larger presence of these beetles. So that's how those three kind of conditions intertwine in regards to natural selection. Now, Darwin's theory consists of 5 observations and 3 inferences. We're going to go through each of them. His first observation dealt with overproduction. So every species tends to produce more offspring than can actually survive into maturity. They overproduce in order to ensure that some of the offspring will indeed last and will indeed live into adulthood and therefore create offspring of their own. So the capacity to overproduce is characteristic of all species, but only a small fraction of the offspring produced will go through the full developmental process and will end up successfully reproducing. So this kind of, or I should say, nested in this tendency of overproduction within species is kind of this notion of species exhibiting exponential fertility. And what I mean by that is species fertility exhibits exponential growth. That's what enables overproduction. They have a very high potential fertility. And in fact, every population has such high potential fertility that its size would continue to increase exponentially from one generation to the next if it was not constrained or left unchecked. Now, if we think about what we actually see in nature, we kind of see something a bit different, right? In nature, we don't really see this populations exhibiting exponential growth like that which is expected by their high potential fertility and exponential fertility rates. Rather, we see populations maintaining more of a stable population size over long periods of time, not taking into consideration kind of the minor fluctuations like seasonal fluctuations. When we actually look at true population curves that we see in nature, they follow more of a logistic growth curve, or this sigmoid curve, where you have the rapid growth of a population, which then begins to slow as it nears this carrying capacity, or the population cap, as I like to call it. And once it reaches carrying capacity, growth stops. So that's when you have the stabilization of the population, and that size is maintained at that carrying capacity. That's kind of the environmental limit for the number of individuals that can be held in a healthy population for a given environment. Now, there's a variety of, or a number of factors that act as kind of checks and balances to keep these populations stable and maintain a stable population size. Those factors include things like competition for food, predation and disease. So all of this, the stable population size, that served as the second observation, so observation 2. Kind of one of the factors playing into a stable population size comes from the third observation, which notes that all resources are limited, right? limited resources, when we say that, we're referring to such things as maybe restrictions in the availability of food or different food resources, or access to food sites, restrictions in habitat size, or different habitats within an ecosystem. Limited resources also refers to mates. So there can be limitations in availability or accessibility to different mates. And because these resources are finite, they are limited in availability and in size, not all individuals will survive and reproduce. Again, you have species going into overpopulation, so creating a lot more offspring than necessary, but there's only so many resources available to suit some number of individuals. And because of that, not all individuals will be able to survive, right? Some are not going to be able to find food, or there won't be enough space, or there won't be enough mates, so they won't reproduce. That's all this third observation. Again, there's this kind of a finite availability, a limitation of natural and environmental resources. And from here we see the arisal of the first inference, or inference 1, which notes that the struggle for food, shelter, and space becomes increasingly severe with overpopulation. In other words, the production of more individuals in an environment, more than that environment can support or maintain, leads to a struggle for existence between individuals of a population, with only a fraction of the offspring actually surviving each generation. So you can really see how observations 1 through 3 are really intertwined with one another, right? You have, again, this overproduction of species, so that you have kind of the security that some offspring will in fact survive. And the limitation of resources kind of stabilizes the actual population size and restricts the amount of individuals that are able to survive and reproduce to maintain a healthy ecosystem. Now, kind of going deeper into this third observation regarding limited resources, there's several interesting behaviors, relationships, and biological concepts that kind of stem from this area. One of them being the concept of a niche. So the availability of resources influences where species can actually exist within an ecosystem. And that relative position of a species or population within an ecosystem is called a niche. Oftentimes you'll see organisms developing slight differences in their niches to avoid competition for resources. They'll do that to limit the amount of niche overlap so that you don't have this intense struggle for existence between species. Hutchinson described the niche as this n-dimensional hypervolume, or this n-dimensional set of resources or environments that a species requires in order to persist. And in that definition, n equates to the number of environmental factors that are needed for the survival and reproduction of that species. Now, when we talk about a niche, there's actually kind of two niches per se to consider. The entire theoretical region that a species could occupy under ideal conditions without any sort of restrictions or limitations, that's the fundamental niche, right? Again, that's the theoretical region that could be occupied. That's essentially this entire hypervolume. Now, what's actually occupied or truly occupied by a species is the realized niche. That's the true niche. This takes into consideration different interactions such as competition that may restrict environments where a species can live. So with this example here, the Chithamus barnacle theoretically could inhabit this entire region of this little rocky outcrop, right? That's its fundamental niche. But it doesn't actually occupy, its true niche is not that entire area. Its true niche is actually this small region here because it shares the small little ecosystem, we'll call this the little ecosystem, with another barnacle species known as Balanus. And Balanus needs to occupy deeper water regions. It doesn't survive well out of the water, so it tends to inhabit deeper depths and lower areas on rock surfaces, so that during low tide it still can maintain kind of deep water. It's still under the water table. So because you have two species here coexisting, the actual niche that the Chithamus occupies is a small area. So that's the realized niche. In ideal conditions, without this Balanus, it could occupy this entire region. So again, this entire region is the fundamental niche for the Chithamus, but its realized niche is this small area here. Two species cannot share the same niche indefinitely. One will eventually outcompete the other. This is a concept called the competitive exclusion principle, which is a product of interspecific competition. Interspecific meaning between different species. This kind of arose, or let's just say that the competitive exclusion principle was founded in 1934 by a biologist named Gauss, who was performing a series of experiments using Paramecium. Paramecium is a genus of protists, and he cultured several different Paramecium species. He had Paramecium aurelia, Paramecium caudata, and Paramecium bursaria. And what he observed was that when aurelia and caudatum were grown separately in separate cultures under their ideal conditions, both grew to a high individual maximum. But this was significantly different when they were grown together in the same culture. When they were grown in the same culture, one actually died out. So P. caudatum was the one to die out. And that's because both of these species eat a very similar resource. So they occupy almost the same niche. And because of that, you get this competitive exclusion principle in effect, where one species will dominate and outcompete the other, and that other species will die out. So that was how that principle came into being. The experiment was also kind of a an interesting example for looking at realized versus fundamental niches. So in a culture of Caudatum and Bursaria, you see them coexisting with one another. And that's because the two species occupy different niches. They eat different resources. So because they occupy different niches, they're able to coexist. But the actual kind of maximum number of individuals that are able to exist within both of those species when they are in the same environment is limited because they are occupying the same space. So in an environment, as you increase the number of species within an area, the amount of individuals that can be held within each of those species is going to decrease. Again, because you're sharing space with more species, so there is more overlap as far as space and what the environment is able to provide and hold. So that's why, again, this is an interesting case of the realized versus fundamental niches, because their realized niches kind of exhibited by their carrying capacities here is much lower than if they were occupying a culture by themselves. Because they're sharing, in order to coexist, their population sizes are much smaller within a shared culture. So a method or a means for coexisting in a lot of ecosystems stems from this notion of resource partitioning. This is when species coexist by using only a part of the available resources. So again, looking at realized niches versus fundamental. Great example is with warblers. So when you're looking at kind of the entire vertical structure of a forest, these warblers coexist with one another because they feed at different areas within the strata. So that's just the different forest layers. So the Cape May warbler feeds at the tips of the higher branches at the top of trees. So it kind of occupies the uppermost region of the forest canopy, whereas the bay-breasted warbler feeds right at the kind of the middle region of the forest. It feeds in the middle region of the trees. And the yellow-rumped warbler is more of a ground feeder, in that its kind of prime area for feeding is on the lower branches and right at the bases of the middle branches of the trees. So by foraging and occupying different regions of the forest strata, these species can coexist. That's resource partitioning, right? This entire region is the fundamental niche, but these species, in an attempt to coexist, will only occupy parts of the available resource or partition the resource in order to coexist. All right, so again, that all ties into that third observation of how species deal with limitations in resources and trying to limit competitive interactions or that struggle for existence because of resource limitations. The fourth observation deals with variation. So we talked about variation as one of the three conditions for that natural selection is consequent of. Variation, again, it's present in all species. All members of the same species will show differences in traits, whether it's in color, shape, size, or behavior. Now, the one major source that operates in generating the variation in which natural selection acts on comes from mutations, right? So when we talk about mutations, they occur independently of an organism's need, right? Mutations are usually these spontaneous changes to DNA that allow for variation, and they are occurring at random with respect to the needs of an organism. They're not occurring because an organism faces a change and needs some sort of adaptation or change in order to manage with that change. That's not why a mutation happens. Mutations aren't always beneficial for the organism. So the ones that are usually selected for with natural selection usually are advantageous or favorable mutations. They provide some sort of benefit to the organism and to its survival. But there are also mutations that are deleterious. They actually are detrimental to the variant's survival or the organism containing that variation. And there are some that are called neutral mutations, meaning it's a change that has no effect on the organism. It provides no benefit, yet no detriment. So it's more of a, it doesn't really do anything. Everything continues as if nothing had happened. So again, mutations are independent of needs. Sometimes they're favorable, sometimes they're not, sometimes they make no difference at all. Mutations that kind of create variations or traits that are inherited that are advantageous to organisms, meaning they increase an organism's chance of survival, are known as adaptations. And we're going to come back to those in a little bit. But understanding how individuals of the same species vary was kind of a key concept to Darwin when developing his theory. Because as we know, as I said before, without variation in population, there's nothing for natural selection to act on. There's nothing for natural selection to select. And as I often say, the greater the amount of variation within a species, the more likely it is to survive, because it's more likely to be better able to deal with environmental changes. There's going to be some individual that will have some trait that allows it to persist. So I like to think of variation kind of as backup plans, and that's why species diversity, genetic diversity is variation. All of that is so important because they allow for survival. And it's, I mean, this evidence of natural selection regarding variation, it exists everywhere. Again, we see it existing in every species, except for ones that are kind of the artificially selected populations, or something with agriculture or your GMOs. But in nature, well, except for grass, all blades of grass are genetically identical. But with most species in nature, you have variation existing, and I can't think of a better example of variation than Hawaiian honeycreepers. As the name suggests, these are birds, so honeycreepers, the Hawaiian honeycreepers is a group of similar bird species, and these species occupy the islands of Hawaii, and they have a really fascinating evolutionary history. I think it's over 70 species have been documented to exist across the islands. Some of those I think have gone extinct, but in general, there's over 70 that have been identified across the islands. And all of these species, as substantiated by DNA analyses, evolved from a single common ancestor that essentially served as a founder species. There was a huge study done to identify which honeycreeper species kind of served as this founder, and that involved this kind of mass comparison of all these different genomic sequences. And what was found was that the original species for initial colonization was actually the Eurasian rosefinch. So all 40 species or 70 species, however many there are, they arose from the single colonization of that species of the Eurasian rosefinch. Okay, so you're asking yourself, how can so many different variations of honeycreepers arise from one species so quickly? Right, you look at them and all these species vary from one another in beak shape and size. And it's incredible to think that you can have such diversity within this group in a small area and for it to arise so quickly. So as I said, they vary in beak shape and size, and those variations are related to habitat and diet. Now that allows them to occupy an array of niches while minimizing competition and niche overlap. It's actually Hawaii's unusual geology that, when we ask about how the honeycreepers were able to kind of split into so many different lineages so quickly, it's really because of the unusual geology in Hawaii that allowed for that rapid radiation of the species into so many different niches. The islands of Hawaii, in case you're not familiar with how they're formed, I like to kind of think of their formation as almost like a conveyor belt method per se. The volcanic islands formed one by one over many years as the Pacific tectonic plate kind of dragged across a hotspot of magma. And each new island provided a new habitat. So you could kind of think of it as a new opportunity for colonization, because each served as a blank state of open habitat, a blank state for evolution to occur. So what happened is a bird from one island would migrate to a new island and encounter this vast openness of ecosystems and niches that could then cause them to adapt and branch off into new species. And the analyses with DNA that were done date this kind of rapid period of speciation to have occurred between 4 to 2.5 million years ago, I think. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. So that was right after the formation of the island Oahu, that honeycreepers kind of went into this rapid speciation and splitting of lineages. So yeah, I think there's 71 species. All but one are endemic. And again, you're able to have such diversity of the species based on their beak shape and size variations, because they were able to occupy so many niches in a rapid period of time. So they're a great example of variation. The fifth and final observation deals with inheritance. So variations are, or some variation is heritable, right? Variations are inherited from parents. Certain variations or adaptations can increase an individual's chances of surviving and reproducing, and those variants that are better suited or the best kind of the best fit survive and leave more offspring. Now, changes in genes produce heritable variation on which natural selection can operate. And when we talk about heritable variation, there's kind of these two underlying assumptions that need to be met in order for natural selection to actually successfully operate. The first is that there must be enough heritable variation in different traits for natural selection to actually act on them. So there has to be enough variation existing between the traits. Second is that the difference in these traits must produce differences in fitness, and that's what also allows natural selection to occur. So there must be enough actual heritable variation in the traits, and the differences between those traits need to produce differences in fitness. So again, they need to kind of going back to this differential reproductive success, right? You have different proportions of traits because of differences in their relative fitness based on the influence they hold for their possessor. So in observation 5, that's where the last two inferences arise from. The first being that there's a differential survival and reproduction among various or varying organisms in a population. Again, those organisms will vary or have differences in traits, and the proportion of differences or the proportion of variance within a population changes over time based on selective pressures, right? That goes back to what we talked about with differential reproductive success. The second inference notes that over many generations, natural selection generates new adaptations or new species, right? So over time, you kind of these different proportions in survivability and reproductive fitness will lead to changes or gradual changes in a population, essentially with more favorable characteristics accumulating over the generations, and that can either lead to, again, these new adaptations, or this kind of the differences can become so stark that you actually have the creation of new species. So those are the 5 observations and 3 inferences. Now, when we talk about natural selection, we typically do so in reference to one or more traits within a population. When we talk about observed traits, those are known as phenotypes. Now, each phenotype arises from a genetic component known as genotype. Genotype refers to the allelic composition or genetic combination, and again, that combination yields a certain phenotype. Now, when we talk about natural selection is acting on or sorting on phenotypic differences, not genotypic differences. So again, it's acting on certain traits or variations in traits that may be favorable or unfavorable for an organism. It's usually selecting for whatever variation of the trait is advantageous or favorable. It's not selecting on the specific allelic composition of that phenotype. So it's not selecting for which individuals are heterozygous or homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. It's not selecting at that level. It's selecting at the level of the phenotype. So the actual variation in the trait itself. And from here, there's a key point that often is forgotten and needs to be remembered. And that's that a gene by itself in nature does not necessarily code for a one or the other type trait. It's not a binomial trait. Rather, a gene codes for a trait in the context of a particular set of environmental conditions. And what I mean by that is that we have to recognize that, again, in nature, phenotype is often dependent on the effects of both genotype and the environment. A great example is with yarrow plants. So this plant species illustrates how elevation and genotype interact to determine the height of individuals within different populations. With these kind of interactions where you have or where phenotypic expression in part depends on environmental condition, we get the production of something called a norm of reaction. So that's referring to, again, the genotype not producing just one or the other trait. It specifies for this kind of range of different phenotypic expressions based on particular environmental conditions or where they're located in an environment, right? That range is called the norm of reaction. So for this figure, looking at genotype 1, so these plants are all of the same genotype. They're all genotype 1. The norm of reaction for genotype 1 is for tall plant height or tall growth at high and low elevations. But at kind of your medium elevations, there's small plant growth. So they're not tall, they're short. That's what is meant by a norm of reaction. It's the same genotype, but the actual phenotype that is expressed differs based on the actual environmental condition or location. Now, long before Darwin, this idea of selection, or this notion of selection, was being used by farmers and breeders to kind of create their idea of model species. So they were manipulating or would only allow the plants and animals with desirable characteristics to reproduce. And that process is called artificial selection. So artificial selection is a process by which humans have modified species over many generations by selecting and breeding individuals that possess desired traits. And the result of such is essentially a narrowing of traits originally present from its ancestors. Right? You look at wild type corn or natural corn looks very different from what you buy in the grocery store, and that's because farmers have selected for certain traits from the original type that are desirable. So they create a product that only contains desirable traits. It's juicy, sweet, nice yellow color, maybe it's drought resistant, etc. Again, you're choosing specific desired traits, and individuals with those desired traits are the ones that are allowed to reproduce. So you have a narrowing of the traits that originally were present. And the purpose of such is to essentially fix desired traits in the population. And when I say make these, or when I say to fix traits in a population, I'm referring to kind of setting the allele frequency to 100%, meaning that is in the entire population, those are the only traits that exist. There's no variation. So you're actually decreasing genetic variability in a small population. And that's deleterious. I mean, yes, you get the products that you want, they have the desirable features, but by creating an entire population that is very limited or lacks genetic variability, puts that entire population at risk for disease. If there's any sort of environmental change, there is no sort of variation that allows natural selection to act on certain individuals that may be able to persist over time, because none of them are going to have an advantageous variant. Again, they're all the same. And with plants, we call these monocultures. Again, it's just this population of the same individual, the same traits. There's no variation, and that's even detrimental to when we're talking about plants and your large agricultural crops. It's deleterious to the soil ecosystem itself. It leaches a lot of the nutrients out, and a lot of kind of prevents growth in different animal communities. So it really degrades the entire health and variability of the ecosystem on a variety of sectors. So these are just kind of summary slides. So with this, we can kind of talk about this briefly as to whether evolution is random or non-random. And it's actually both. So the production of variation among organisms, that component is random, right? Mutation does not generate traits preferentially. As far as the survival of different traits, that's more of a non-random component. Natural selection acts on specific traits or certain traits that are considered favorable because they give their possessors advantages relative to others. So the production of variation is random, but as far as which traits survive and therefore are kind of preserved in a population is more of a non-random component for natural selection. We'll come back to these when we talk about sexual selection. So before, when we were talking about variation, I mentioned adaptations, right? So adaptations are inherited traits that make an organism more fit or more suited in its abiotic and biotic environment. So it's it's advantageous. It increases their survivability and reproductive function. And that arises as a direct result of natural selection. Entwined with this, so when we talk about survivability, backing up, I should say, kind of when we talk about natural selection, you oftentimes hear people throw that line, survival of the fittest. And when we talk about the fittest, or the most fit for their environment, the best suited for their environment, that's referring to fitness. Fitness refers to an organism's ability to survive and reproduce, and therefore its ability to pass traits on to offspring. So when we say something is the fittest, we mean it has traits that enable it to survive and reproduce. When we're referring to fitness, often it's in terms of individual fitness, but there's also inclusive fitness, which looks at the actual fitness of a population as a whole. So there are two separate ones, but all in all, fitness is the ability for an organism to survive and reproduce. And there are a lot of cool adaptations in the world. So these guys, this little kind of weird blue looking thing here is a Galapagos marine iguana. A lot of people call them disgusting and clumsy, but they're actually really important. They were key in kind of Darwin's creation of the theory of natural selection. Galapagos marine iguanas are the only aquatic lizards in the world, and they have specialized adaptations that allow them to kind of occupy aquatic habitats, certain adaptations that allow them to swim and dive for food. So some of these adaptations, they have these long curled claws that are very dull, and you allow them to hold on to slippery rocks so that they don't slip. And they eat seaweed with the help of their shorter snout, which is kind of used to scrape algae and seaweed off rocks. And they have a long flattened tail that helps to facilitate swimming. And these are all stark differences, or morphological differences, that separate them or make them different from their close relative, the mainland iguana. So this is the terrestrial species that's adapted for eating leaves and trees. So by having these adaptations, the marine iguana is able to occupy a different niche and exploit that niche. And it's different from its, again, these two are evolutionarily related. They come from a common ancestor, but they differ because of structural adaptations that allow them to occupy different niches. Similar concept with the Antarctic toothfish. So this is I think belongs in the cod family. They inhabit the frigid waters surrounding Antarctica. And they're unique because they're able to persist in these extreme environments because they have a glycoprotein in their blood that actually serves as antifreeze. They have an antifreeze glycoprotein. And that allows them to survive in freezing waters because they can't produce their own body heat like mammals. So by having antifreeze proteins in their blood, it stops ice from forming and it allows the fish to stay alive. It actually the protein will inhibit the growth of ice crystals by kind of absorbing different molecules at that surface. I don't know if it's, I don't know really the current literature on it. I haven't looked recently, but I know at one point in time, researchers were working to isolate the gene that produces this glycoprotein and load it into strawberries to help with frost tolerance for better food crops during winter and freeze events. But I haven't read anything recently. I have to check that out. Let's see some other examples. So these guys are cool. Whiptail and fence lizards. So again, this kind of goes back to natural selection acting on phenotypic differences, not genotypic. The whiptail and fence lizards are, when they're on dark soil, they are dark colored. So in the brown desert habitat, they are this very dark brown colored. When they're found on white sands in lighter environments, they exhibit a much lighter skin color, and that allows them to have better camouflage. So they lowers their predation rates. This is a case of the same gene. So it involves the MC1R gene, which codes, is a gene coding for color, more specifically by influencing the uptake or reception of melanin by melanocytes. And it's in these lizards, again, it's the same gene, but it's kind of gone through convergent evolution per se. In the dark ancestral lizards, the gene codes for these MC1 receptors that, again, allow melanocytes, which are a type of cell, to make melanin, and those are then picked up by the receptors and allows the animal, or makes the animal, dark in color. In the white sand-dwelling fence lizard and your white sand whiptail lizard, they have this gene, but it's been mutated. So they have a mutated MC1R gene. In the fence lizards, that mutation is dominant. So they only need one copy of the mutated gene to kind of get that white color, and it operates in these guys by lowering or reducing the amount of MC1 receptors that are integrated into cell membranes. And because you have fewer MC1 receptors, you have less uptake or production of the melanin, because you don't have, again, that kind of facilitation between your melanocytes and the receptors, so you get a lighter color. In whiptail lizards, again, it's the same gene that's mutated, but in order to have that light coloration, the mutation is actually recessive, meaning for that light color in your whiptail lizards, you need two copies of the gene. And the mechanism by which that operates is different from what happens with the white fence lizard. With your white whiptail, by having that two copies of the mutated gene, it doesn't affect the number of receptors that are integrated into cell membranes. Rather, it adversely affects their ability to transmit signals. So the signal used to actually make melanin is not transmitted. And that, again, allows for the production of a white lizard. Well, that's a really interesting case. Of course, I can always draw back on research that I've been involved with. So when I was conducting research in Ecuador, I was studying the non-myrmecophytic and myrmecophytic mechanisms in different Cecropia species. Some Cecropia species utilize ants as an anti-herbivory defense system. Others are not defended by ants. Instead, they'll use kind of like a chemical warfare as an anti-herbivore defense system. Now, the ones that are your myrmecophytic Cecropia species. Myrmecophytic are the ones that have this association with ants. These species have some really neat morphological and structural adaptations that allow them to have these mutualistic relationships with Azteca ants. Azteca ants are the species that kind of serve as the little defenders of these Cecropia species. So the Cecropia species actually, over time, hollows out its inner node. So it has a hollow inner node that serves as a kind of provides a housing site for these ants, and it has little different chambers, again, to house the ant species. It also produces these glycoprotein blobs that are known as Mullerian bodies that serve as a food source for the ants. They have a lot of nutrients, and the ants will eat them, so that the Cecropia species, again, provides a housing site and a food source for the ants. In return, the ants provide defense. And it's this beautiful mutual relationship that has lasted over hundreds of years. But this is a neat example. These are the Mullerian bodies that the ants will eat. These are the little Azteca ants. But again, these really interesting adaptations made by the plant to support these mutualistic relationships that have allowed for the survival of these myrmecophytic species for hundreds and hundreds of years. When we also talk about adaptations, we have to talk about antibiotic resistance. So this is a big topic that I don't think is gaining enough attention. It's not a huge interest to the pharmaceutical companies because it's not high profit. So you don't get a high profit associated with research in antibiotic resistant bacteria, which is unfortunate because this is a growing problem throughout the globe and will continue to worsen, particularly with the overuse and overprescription or improper kind of adherence to how you're supposed to take antibiotics by patients. Antibiotic resistance, there's some you'll have some antiviral resistance, antibiotic resistance, antifungal resistance. Antibiotic is the big one. So this is dealing with your naughty little bacteria. So bacteria have very interesting mechanisms for gene transfer. They have something known as horizontal gene transfer, which involves the transfer of genetic information between unrelated individuals. So it would be like me passing my genetic information onto my next door neighbor or onto one of my friends from high school. And there's like two major ones that come into play with antibiotic resistance. Is the method known as transformation and the method of conjugation. So transformation is when bacteria can take up naked DNA from their environment. In order to do so, the bacteria have to be competent, meaning they have kind of certain proteins and binding proteins or degradative proteins in their cytoplasm and cell membrane. So they'll actually take up this DNA from the environment and incorporate it into their bacterial genome or onto a plasmid. Plasmid is just extra chromosomal material or genetic material. Conjugation is when you actually have either the transfer of transfer of genes between bacteria or transfer of genes from a plasmid between bacteria, and the transfer occurs through what's known as a sex pilus. People often call it bacterial mating, but they're not actually mating. It's again just transfer of genetic material, but it's not sexual reproduction. A lot of times what is being transferred is some sort of genes that have resistant capabilities. That's what you see on a lot of plasmids that are transferred. They'll have antibiotic resistance genes, or they'll have degradative genes, which allow bacteria to degrade certain environmental pollutants or toxins. But with antibiotic resistance, what happens? You have a population of bacteria. And because of variation, there are some bacteria that are not resistant to that antibiotic, so they're susceptible to that antibiotic. And then there might be some individuals that are resistant or a little more hardy against that antibiotic. So when you, in the presence of the antibiotic, all susceptible individuals are killed off. But there is risk that those who are more hardy or resistant will survive, especially if an individual doesn't continue through with their full course of antibiotics. So even though you have the death of the susceptible individuals, these resistant individuals can suddenly proliferate and can actually introduce a secondary infection. So with your antibiotics, you kill off the weak ones, but the strong ones can persist. And it's from those strong ones, the persistence of those strong ones, where you get antibiotic resistance occurring. That's going into conjugation, which I was just talking about before. But again, this is a global problem. And you see it across a suite of different bacteria. You see it with E. coli, you see it with Klebsiella, your Streptococcus pneumoniae, the Staphylococcus bacteria, right? Your antibiotic-resistant MRSA. That's a huge issue. Klebsiella is a huge issue as far as causing secondary infections in hospitals. A lot of your entero bacteria, meaning the gut bacteria, have become highly resistant. And again, this is not just with antibiotics. We're seeing the same issue with antimicrobials. So antimicrobials focuses more on kind of like your kind of the suite of your microbes. So again, looking at the antivirals or your antibiotics, the antifungals, even some of the malaria medications. Those are great antimicrobials that operate on the protozoal kind of agent that carries malaria. But as in all of these subsets, you're seeing increases in the amount of resistant strains that are arising. And this is a map that's kind of showing the projected estimation of the number of deaths that will be attributed to this suite of antimicrobial resistance on a yearly basis by 2050. Again, you see it's a global issue, extremely high in the mortality numbers. I think this, they were saying, would surpass the mortality for crime, car accidents, you name it. Again, it's turning into global. It is a global issue, and it's going to continue being a global issue. So that's a great example of adaptation that's great for our little microbial friends, but not so much for us. So to finish up, when we talk about adaptations, there are some adaptive structures that kind of are examples of exaptation. That's when you have certain features or traits acquiring different functions that they originally weren't adapted for, right? The main one being feathers, right? So feathers were initially believed, or are initially believed to have evolved from scales made of keratin for insulation. Back with your little early dinosaur friends. And then the feathers arose, or the kind of the purpose of these scales, I should say, was for insulation. And then eventually they evolved through a series of different kind of gyrations into feathers. And as feathers, they were co-opted for display and then later for flight. Feathers likely arose in a lineage of the theropod dinosaurs. And again, it originally evolved for insulation and then co-opted in the later stages of evolution, kind of in your later lineages, co-opted for facilitating flight and gliding, as well as your kind of display, so courting or courtship behaviors. All right, well, I think that covers about all I wanted to say about natural selection. If you have questions, just post them in the comments section below, or if you have any nice additions, just post them below. Anyway, enjoy your day, and I hope you enjoyed the video.